Today's episode is brought to you by K. Chess's Famous Men Who Never Lived, out now from Tin House Books. Chess's debut novel follows a group of refugees from an alternate timeline, a parallel universe as they adjust to life in our own New York City and reckon with the loss of the places and loved ones they left behind. Charles Yu calls it conceptually adventurous yet full of feeling, and Karen Thompson Walker says this inventive book does what only fiction can do, describes an impossible world in order to more clearly show us our own. For readers of Station 11 and Exit West, Famous Men Who Never Lived explores the effects of displacement on our identities, the communities that come together through circumstance, and the power of art to save us. I'm particularly excited to share this conversation with writer, translator, and poet Cristina Rivera Garza, as it is a rare treat to get to talk to a writer touring for their book in a translated form. And Rivera Garza is such an incredible thinker about her own work, about living in a world of two languages, and about why she foregrounds what she calls second languageness in her work. For those subscribed to the bonus archive, in addition to Rivera Garza reading from her long poem, Third World, there's also an extended conversation with one of the most important translators of Latin American literature into English, Suzanne Jill Levine, about translating Rivera Garza, as well as about what it is like to pursue a career in translation. You can find all of this, as well as the possibility of getting other Tin House goodies, from Morgan Parker's Magical Negro to Ursula K. Le Guin's Conversations on Writing, at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. Enjoy today's program. Good morning and welcome to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's guest is writer, poet, translator, and critic Cristina Rivera Garza. Rivera Garza is the author of 6 novels, 3 collections of short stories, 5 collections of poetry, and 3 nonfiction books. She's the only author who has won the Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz Prize 2 times, in 2001 for her novel Nadie me verá llorar, and in 2009 for her novel La Muerte me da. She is also the winner of the German Anna Segers Prize and the French Roger Caillois Award for Latin American Literature. Cristina Rivera Garza is Distinguished Professor in Hispanic Studies at the University of Houston and instrumental in starting the first Spanish-language creative writing PhD program in the United States there. Rivera Garza studied urban sociology at the National Autonomous University of Mexico and earned a doctorate in Latin American history at the University of Houston with a dissertation on La Castañeda, Mexico's most infamous mental hospital, and the social history of mental illness in early 20th century Mexico. Rivera Garza is the translator of writers from Juliana Spar to Don Miche into Spanish, as well as the books Notes on Conceptualism by Vanessa Place and Robert Fitterman, and The Undercommons by Fred Moten and Stefano Harney. Yet despite being one of the best-known writers in Mexico today, having won 6 of Mexico's highest literary awards, and with Carlos Fuentes calling Nadie me verá llorar as not only one of the most perturbing and beautiful novels ever written in Mexico, but one of the most notable works of fiction in the literature of the Spanish-speaking world at the start of the 21st century, Rivera Garza's work is just now being considered and discussed in the Anglophone world, with 2 translations of her work in the last year. The Iliac Crest out from Feminist Press, translated by Sarah Booker, and the book she's here to discuss today, The Taiga Syndrome, out from Dorothy Books, translated by Suzanne Jill Levine and Aviva Kena, with starred reviews from Publishers Weekly and Kirkus, and picked by the BBC as one of the best books of 2018, National Book Award-winning poet Daniel Borzutzky says the following of Rivera Garza's latest book in English. If the Taiga Syndrome is a book of illness, it's also about exile, disappearance, borders, love, language and translation, desire, capitalism and its discontents, fairy tales, and what it means to be possessed by the madness of others and the madness of ourselves. The murmurs that haunt the detective in the Taiga Syndrome evoke the history of Mexican fiction, most notably Juan Rulfo, but this is not a religious state of purgatory. It's more like Apocalypse Now, fused with the worlds of Clarice Lispector and Jorge Luis Borges. In other words, there is no one writing novels as phantasmagorically exquisite as Cristina Rivera Garza's The Taiga Syndrome, which is both quietly poetic and narratively unhinged, a crucial addition to her distinguished oeuvre. Welcome to Between the Covers, Cristina Rivera Garza.
Hello, I'm so happy to be here.
So on the surface at least, the Taiga Syndrome is about a failed ex-detective who has turned to writing noir mystery novels, but nevertheless is sort of drawn out of retirement and takes the case of a man who wants to find the woman who left him, who disappeared into the taiga, the boreal forest, with another man never to return. But it doesn't really feel like that is what the Taiga Syndrome is about, even though that's, I think, a pretty accurate description of the plot. So perhaps we could begin with the questions that animated the project for you, or the circumstances or impulses or desires.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. What you described is essentially the plot, but I have never believed the plot is the most important component of a novel. It's one of them. It's obviously relevant, but novels or writing projects, more generally speaking, are made of many other operations. And so what I would have to say here is that my female nameless detective has been with me now through several books. So I have another novel and 3 or 4 long short stories in which she's been leading the whole exploration, the exploration that relies on plot, but also the linguistic and more the larger exploration of the book. And in this case, I would say that I was very interested in exploring the possibility of moving as far away as I could, literally in terms of, linguistically speaking, in terms of the human search that is at the core of every single writing project, I suppose. And so I wanted to move far away. I wanted to know how far away I could go while being still legible. So if you are really moving away, if you are really trying to cross as many borders as you can, there is going to be a point in which you will become illegible. Right, and as someone who likes to take risks in terms of my writing projects, I want to move and explore new territories, but at the same time, I want to make sure that I have a reader with me, that I have an accomplice, a companion with me, and that obviously implies that I have to be still legible. So I wanted to test those waters, and I suppose that's one of the reasons why I chose this landscape, this geography, this territory, the taiga, for someone who, I was writing this novel in between Mexico City and San Diego, so someone who is in this area of the world, perhaps the taiga is what appears to be more, as far away as you can go. And so that's the initial, I would say, impulse or the question that I had in mind. Yeah.
Well, I would love to explore some of the ways in which you have us cross borders of language and linguistics. So, because I feel like one of the ways you could look at this book is it's a book about language.
Yes.
Or more specifically about the translational aspects of communication and signification.
Yeah.
Because everything that we experience goes through multiple levels of mediation, and thus we have to sort of question the authenticity of everything that comes to us as a reader. But I also think the characters, in a way, have to question what they're receiving as characters. So the most obvious way this is true is with the relationship between the detective and the translator that the detective hires to be able to speak to the native inhabitants of the taiga. You have this wonderful line about the translator that goes, "He chose to use the language that we would speak during our journey through the boreal forest, a language that was not strictly his nor mine, a third space, a second tongue in common." And so in this sense, we don't just rely on the translator to carry meaning across the divide between a language foreign to the detective and her own, but into a shared language that neither one of them actually speak as their primary language. So the language that they're operating in is not the primary language of either character. So tell us why you wanted this setup and what that setup does, what that setup provides for you in the story.
Yeah, what an interesting question. Very often we go through, when you're watching movies, and they take place in foreign countries that obviously speak a different language, a language other than your own. Very often we act. There is this silent pact. Like, we are supposed to act as though communication is just achievable. That is going to be somehow smooth and clear. And it seems to me that in many situations that we go through in life, the case is just the opposite. That even if we speak the same language, we need mechanisms that allow us to translate the experience of others to our own experience, right? And in this novel, I wanted to make sure that all these different levels of mediation and different levels of negotiation in between languages were a central component of the novel. So as much as we spoke about plot at the beginning, but I wanted this mediation to be sort of the main protagonist of the novel. And that's one of the reasons, in addition to the presence of the translator and the description of how slow and how complicated and the many layered process that translating involves, I wanted to be sure that the readers knew that this novel, in fact, was also going through a very complicated mediating process. And that's one of the reasons why I chose to start most of many paragraphs with the word that, que, in Spanish, which is a sign of indirect speech. So we when we use that we know that there is someone else involved, that there is been another presence and someone else's intervention and interpretation in whatever I'm saying or whatever the character is saying. And I wanted the reader to be able to listen to these different echoes and the possibility that these other participations were tainted, deforming, informing too, but somehow reshaping what the characters were going to be understanding, and therefore how they were going to be reacting to whatever they were going through. So that adds a level of complexity that I wanted to bring to the novel, because it's the level in which I'm asking the readers, you are the next step. Your interpretation is as valid as the ones that we are going to be discussing here in this book. And it's not going to be easy, right? You're going to have to risk something too.
Yeah, I love that take on it. Could we hear a little bit? I marked out a little bit of the section about the translator, and I was hoping maybe you'd read a little section for us.
This one? Perfect.
Yeah.
Let me see. I remember how many times I repeated the same phrase, tongue to tongue, a speaker of their tongue who would translate everything into my tongue. A smile, no, a laugh, a look of intrigue or distress, a sigh or something more serene. In the report I would write for the man who had had 2 wives, I would ask him to take into account that nothing had happened exactly as I claimed. I would tell him that nothing happens as it is written, and I would constantly repeat this or something like it. I would ask him in a careful and tactful way, assuming that he knew, but realizing also that these types of things are always hard to bear in mind, to take into account that there was a great distance between speech and writing. Take your time, I would remind him. Read as if there were many minutes, even hours, between the words spoken and the ones written down, transcribed, the phrases. I would tell him, for example, when I wrote, I asked them if they had electricity and they responded by showing me a lit candle, that he should realize I had in fact pronounced a question, but before I received the answer, which came much later, the translator had made me repeat the question several times, and then had said it several times himself, until the inhabitants of the village in the Taiga would understand it and answer. And then we had to wait, translator, inhabitants, myself, until the action, showing the candle and articulating the words, we don't have electricity, was heard and understood, first with surprise, and then, finally, disbelief.
We've been listening to Cristina Rivera Garza read from The Taiga Syndrome from Dorothy Books. So even before the detective mentions the active translation, she talks about a great distance between speech and writing, which suggests that this is true even when there's no actual translator involved, that this distance exists even when there's no negotiation between two languages. Now we're negotiating between speech and writing. And you mentioned earlier when you were talking about translation about also this translational aspect of just communication, even if we're in the same language.
Yeah.
So, and I was hoping maybe you could lean into that a little bit more about the distance between thought and speech and thought and language, that perhaps translation is also happening not just between people, but within one person.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I believe so. I think one of the greatest challenges is as we write books, I mean, that's at least the challenge I take very seriously. What my desire when I'm writing is to bring experience into paper. And that's one of the most complicated, ethically challenging aspects of our trade. So what do we do with a language that belongs to everybody, to entire communities of practitioners? What do we do with that piece of language that we use, that we are trying to inhabit and work with, and with the experience of others? We are always talking, writing about others, even when we write about ourselves. It's once it is written down, it's another material right there, right? So that transition, thinking about that transition, accepting the challenge that thinking about that brings up, I think that's the most interesting and inescapable element of writing. We all tell stories. That's how we become social beings, right? But writers, I think, especially our or at least what I see as my field, what makes me a writer, not only a storyteller, is to think precisely about that space that goes from experience to language, from experience into page. Because obviously, yes, the negotiation that we see more clearly in the translation in between two languages is always present in our relationship with ourselves, with language, the way in which we approach our material world, and the way in which we participate in what language does in terms of making all those experiences shareable. So I don't think of this as a minor element. I think that goes to the heart of writing. That's when writing becomes an ethical project and a political one as well, obviously. Mm-hmm.
You've before quoted Mireille Gancel's ideas about translation translations as transhumanists.
Yeah, it's a wonderful book, by the way.
It is?
Yeah. Great.
Some of those quotes you've said from her are that translation is both a risk-taking and a continual re-examination. That translation is a learning to listen to the silences in between the lines, and that translation is the essence of hospitality. Mm-hmm. And you've also said that you are less interested in fidelity and more on what you call versioning, that instead of thinking of translation as a smooth transition or harmonious process, you look at how translation brings up dissent or discordance or deviation, and the ways translation raises issues of power. I'd be interested in hearing more about what you mean by versioning in light of this.
Yeah.
And in relationship to the Taiga Syndrome also.
Yeah. Well, I have to say, if we start to talk about the Taiga Syndrome, how happy I've been working with translators Jill Levine and Aviva Khanna. And I can tell you a number of stories about our conversations in regards to specific phrases and all that. It's been just a pleasure working with them. Jill is a legendary translator, and she's worked with many of the boom writers of the 60s and 70s, and I've been just so privileged in working with her. And I think that's something that we shared, our agreement that about translation not being necessarily these, as I put it there, a harmonious process, something that is going to inherently achieve some sort of peaceful agreement on things, right? But it's a possibility for us to take a look at various ways of looking at and approaching the world in which we live. And I think in that sense, translation allows us to generate a critical thinking and when in luck, a critical practice as well, right? My ideas about translation have changed dramatically ever since I started to translate myself. At the beginning, it was just the impulse when I really loved something, and I thought that my friends in Mexico or in Latin America would benefit from, specific poems or essays. I would just, out of love, I would try to translate. And then I've been more careful about, picking my projects. But in doing that, I'm always interested in pieces of work that might, or in my view, will generate cross-border dialogues, and dialogues that I obviously think that are relevant for our life, for our political lives and our daily lives in whatever we live, right? And in that sense, I'm not as interested in issues of, as I said there, of fidelity, obviously I want to capture what the core, the heart of the works that I'm interested in, but I think I'm always thinking in terms of the context, in terms of the larger conversation that I see them being part of, and in that sense, I'm talking about versions of, meaning that my activity as a translator is also informing the work and making that work something totally new in many ways, which has happened with these translators too. I've told Jill and Sarah Booker, the translator of the Iliad Crest, that what they've given me with these translations are new books that are new to me as well.
Yeah, and what's interesting about the books, obviously these are new versions of the same book, or not the same book, but versioning also sort of enters the plot of these books, I think, also. So one of the things that makes the Taiga Syndrome, I think, strange and wonderful is you've juxtaposed two different genres. And these two genres have, traditionally speaking, I think, have a different relationship to plot. And I think they also have a different relationship to sentence level syntax. So we have the detective genre or the noir novel, and we have the fairy tale. And I think of versions and versioning when I think of both of these aspects of the Taiga Syndrome. So on the one hand, we have a failed detective who's trying to write fiction based on her failed cases. So in a sense, she's versioning her own failed career. But then she comes out of retirement to pursue the case of a missing woman in the forest. So there's this sort of doubling back on the original text of her life. And then on the other hand, we have a man and a woman who disappear into the wilderness, into the unknown forest. And that's sort of the heart of many fairy tales, this story of a boy and a girl disappearing, and you do an explicit meditation on the versioning of fairy tales within the Taiga Syndrome. So you look at the quote-unquote original versions of Hansel and Gretel and Little Red Riding Hood versus the more well-known and more recent versions. So I was hoping maybe you could talk about some of the things that you see that were different in the original or older versions and the newer versions, and what the gap between those two was doing for you in terms of your meditation and in the Taiga Syndrome narrative.
Forest intrigued me greatly, and as most kids in I guess middle class backgrounds, even if I didn't read, which I did, but if I hadn't read fairy tales, childhood is informed by fairy tales in one way or another. That's the kind of societies I think that we are. And I think the detective, the noir, the genre, it's just so common to us. Even if you don't read them, you know how they work. And I think what I thought at the beginning when I was working on the territory, on the heart of this project, the Taiga Syndrome, I thought that if I really wanted to move as far away as possible, I needed to have something that was legible for myself and for readers. I didn't want to move in those places by myself alone. And I thought that it would be very useful to bring with me these genres that readers and people, generally speaking, understand and are familiar with. And so in that sense, recurring to these fairy tales, specifically these two, the Hansel and Gretel and the Caperucita Roja, were very useful in terms of creating a familiarity that may not scare people that wanted to go with me to the limits of the forest. But at the same time, I wanted to think about a more contemporary forest, a forest in which exploitation is taking place, where labor is a major component of place, in which issues of sex and discrimination and stuff like that are also relevant elements of this forest life. And what I thought is that capitalism, generally speaking, is our fairy tale, and I wanted to bring that, the ferocity of that mode of producing wealth, that and the great consequences that brings upon landscape and human life. So that was my forest. And what I thought is that the earlier versions of Hansel and Gretel, for example, are way more related and more explicit about all these different questions of accumulation than were later versions of these stories. And so I wanted to get to the heart of that, to that more obvious and bloodier and more complicated story, which I think, goes to the heart of many of our dilemmas, I think, in our world as we live in it.
Well, when you talk about wanting to make a contemporary forest, one of my favorite lines in the book is from the man who hires the detective to find the woman who left him, where he says, "This is not a fairy tale, detective." But then he goes on to add sort of dubiously, "This is a story about being in love." Mm-hmm. And of course, there's no story that's more mediated and more fairy tale-like than the stories of love. And I'm sure it sort of casts a light back on the fact that I'm guessing most people around love are enacting gestures that are informed by fairy tales. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. In a contemporary way.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And I think that happens a lot with our major narratives. And I think creative writing is a way to explore the other side of these narratives and to make them more complicated, or as complicated as going through them is. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So the word taiga refers both to a place, the boreal forest, and also, so the boreal forest in the tundra south of the tundra of Siberia, North America. And also it refers to a syndrome, a syndrome that occurs where certain inhabitants of the taiga suffer terrible anxiety attacks and make suicidal attempts to escape the taiga. So given that it's both a place and a psychological state, in a response to a question about this, you answered that you think less about space as such and more about territory, which you describe as space plus politics. And I think maybe you touched on this already in the way that you're looking at, say, the works of the fairy tale of capitalism and accumulation within the forest. But could you talk a little bit more about the differences between territory and space?
Yeah, I've been reading a lot, and I'm very interested in recent works that have rightfully placed attention on our natural world. But I have also become very concerned about ways in which this seems to deflect attention about the many conflicts that this whole thing entails. And so at times I'm rather perplexed at the fact that we seem to be writing about nature as though nature is something that remains out there for our contemplation and or enjoyment or preoccupation, right? And I think we're inextricably linked. And in that very close organic relationship lies, many of the dilemmas that we're going through as contemporary society that we are. And so I just wanted to remind myself, at least, that whenever we talk about nature, whenever we talk about space, whenever we talk about landscape, we are in fact referring to a very conflicted areas of our social life. And these conflicts might be, political, economic at heart, but are also metaphysical and spiritual, and they just crisscross all our experience and the way in which we conceive ourselves as agents of or participants in this whole context. And so I just think that writing is a way of, as I said earlier, complicating things or trying to share them in a way that is as complicated as we go through. Very often we don't have either the time or the predisposition to, we have to go through our life, right? We have to make things manageable, right?
Yeah. But
then we have books too. And in books we're not going to resolve those issues, but at the same time we might give the space so that these sort of multi-layered experience might bloom, might become as complex as they are. That's what concerns me when I'm writing. And that was a difference that I was trying to make in terms of space and territory.
In case you just tuned in, we're talking today to Cristina Rivera Garza about her latest book in English, The Taiga Syndrome, from Dorothy. I wanted to read another quote that you said, and it is, just as I write from and through a body among bodies, I do so in territories linked by economic inequality and cultural diversity. Am I addressing the question of accumulation? This is what I ask of my writing process. Am I attentive enough to issues of territory and embodiment? Answers to these questions not only generate different plot lines, but also encourage a wide array of formal explorations. I am increasingly interested in the material conditions that allow or don't allow the writing process, and I have tried to bring this interest as a motive, both in terms of plot and in terms of literary strategy in all my writing projects. Mm-hmm. I was hoping maybe you could explain further both what you mean by the question of accumulation and also what you mean by the material conditions that allow or don't allow the writing process, and any ways that might link into the bringing of the Taiga Syndrome into the world too.
Yeah. Usually, this is not always the case, but usually when you are in writing workshops, most of the attention goes to plot lines, creation of characters, dialogue, narrative arcs, things of that sort. Mm-hmm. And I'm talking mostly about fiction right now.
Right.
But then it seems to me that when we started to pose questions about bodies in connection to other bodies and production, which is essentially the question about accumulation, right? I mean, what do we do in terms of producing the world in which we live? And how do we connect with others, and in what kind of vertical ways we do that, how our hierarchy is created and all that. So once we start to think about that, I think it's very complicated to go back into these little boxes of, character and the psychology of the character and the dialogue and things like that. Not that they are not relevant or that are non-existent. Obviously, these are issues that we work with. These are our tools, the tools of our trade. But I think they become something else. And I'm very interested in this something else that they might become if we actually continue pressing these questions into the writing as such. I'm a reader of so-called experimental literature. I'm very interested in that kind of radical exploration of language and what it entails. I'm a reader of experimental literature from the United States, mostly from the West Coast. And one of the things that I become also concerned about is that at times those literary experiments seem to be done at the level of form, but not necessarily, they are not necessarily reaching all these other questions that linked literature and writing to politics and to ethics. So I become way more interested in the kind of literary experimentation that takes into account how race and class and gender and linguistic diversity and accumulation and labor and work and all that kind of thing problematizes what we do. And what we do is that what we talked about at the beginning of this conversation, how it problematizes our relationship with language as practitioners of a language that we don't own, right? And as practitioners of languages that, at least in my case, I don't aspire to master as much as to work through. And it seems to me that once I get into that state of mind, I start to think about writing in such a in a way that does not necessarily emphasizes the usual components of fiction, as I was listing those at the beginning.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to return to this, the doubling of the psychic state, the Taiga Syndrome, and the geography, the Taiga, in relationship to translation and versioning, and whether one can really separate psychic states from where one's body is in place. Which makes me think of a couple things either you have said or your narrator has said. You've mentioned something that Antoine Volodine used to say, that the ultimate end of books is to meddle with the dreams of the readers, thus forming a kind of dreamlike community, which I love.
Isn't that great?
Yeah,
I love it.
Yeah.
Yes.
And our narrator in the Taiga Syndrome says, "We all carry a forest inside us, yes, the wilderness to which we are returning, the long way to becoming missing. We go to a place we imagined as foreign and find instead that we are home." The quote, which I love, makes me think of something that Ricky Ducournay said in her collection, The Deep Zoo, that the forest is the place human dreams come from, and that the paradox of the real is that a thing must be dreamed before it can be real.
Oh, that's a wonderful quote.
And this to me almost suggests that for a thing to be real, we must have a place that exists that resists our comprehension, a place of otherness where dreams can be born. So that the space where a dream is born is something that is almost not us, but then becomes us, which makes me wonder what happens to the real when we destroy the place of otherness. Which in the case of fairy tales is more often than not the forest. So when I think about the differences between, this is just me, pontificating or theorizing, but when I think about how the forest has become less bloody and less dangerous and less unknown in fairy tales, I wonder, does that correlate with the ways in which forests have become more humanized over time, or smaller and
Or
more
dehumanized too.
Yeah, and dehumanized, but more managed in a way, so less completely resistant to our knowing them. But I was hoping you could speak to these questions that your narrator poses, which are: what is between imagining a forest and living in a forest? What brings together the writing of a forest with the lived experience of a forest?
This is just a wonderful take on these questions, which you just mentioned. And I just can't help but say, first of all, that what you have described as this place of unknowing, this place of where primeval questions arise, to me, that's writing. I mean, that's a place. That's my forest in many ways. I go to writing less because I know what I'm writing about, and more because I'm trying to explore things that I might be alive or bothering me in my intuition. But and then the writing is actually the searching for that. And not that I'm writing specifically to look for answers, as the saying goes, but just I have to go through the whole trajectory. I have to follow the thread of thought and to its ultimate consequences. And sometimes these consequences are not the production of knowledge, but the production of complicity, the production of these, what you mentioned, the dreamlike connection with others that is not necessarily based on what we know, but what we might produced in just by way of contact. And that's something that we cannot know in advance, that we will know, if at all, when it's happening. And to me, that's just a description of what writing is. You know, that's there are books, entire books, that have shaped my life, and not only my intellectual life, but my life as such, and not necessarily because I understood what they were about, not because I got the message, but because they haunt me in all their openness. And that's the kind of book that I cherish, the ones that I keep with me, and the ones that I aspire to write. So that's the reason why Bolodin's quote is so relevant to me. I truly believe that when your book becomes a component of someone else's dreams, then you have achieved something.
Yeah.
Who cares about the reviews? Although I do like them.
Especially when they're good.
Yeah, when they're good, I love them. But once they become part of a person's dreams, then I really think that then you have achieved something.
Yeah. I love that as a potential aspiration.
Yeah, totally.
So I want to take a lot of what we've discussed and bring it to this question and the phenomenon of borders.
Yeah.
Because much of your work deals with this question of borders. And Sarah Booker, the translator of the Iliac Crest, she writes in her translator's note for the book that the Iliac Crest engages with borders between the North and the South, the living and the dead, male and female, fiction and reality, and lucidity and madness. And I feel like many of these polarities exist in the Taiga Syndrome too. But when I think of the taiga, the boreal forest, and taiga as a psychic, potentially as a dream space, I also think of writing outside of fairy tales where the forest is a place not just of danger but of transformation.
Yeah.
And it feels like that space has disappeared as forests have disappeared. When I'm trying to link the taiga to the Taiga Syndrome, and I'm thinking about the role forests used to play even in non-fairy tale stories, like in 19th century American short fiction.
Of course.
You'd still see the forest and the wilderness as a place that everyday people would pass through. And it was a space, a non-human space. So like in a Nathaniel Hawthorne story, there weren't just the dangers of wolves or other animals, but there were also the dangers of humans breaking norms in those spaces. So you might find people who go to the forest to operate under different rules than the town that they came from. that could be in some of his stories, for instance, someone performing a satanic ritual or witchcraft, or something called witchcraft to further other whatever they're doing that's different than what they do in their normal lives. So I wondered if human dreams come from the forest, and if something has to be dreamed for it to become real, if it is something about the borderlessness of forests, of actual forests and psychic ones, something about the possibility of crossing borders and crossing norms that makes these spaces vital. And I guess I wondered about that in terms of, you're not just pushing people through borders of language, you're pushing people to the edges of human civilization in a way. So we're going to the margins of where humans live. And is there something about that, the seeking of a borderless space that used to be, I think, almost narratively, architecturally part of the stories we used to tell, and now we find another way to do that, since often people who are writing aren't having forests as part of their lives anymore. But I want to hear a little bit about the pushing to the boundary of landscape, which also then becomes a psychological pushing.
Yeah. You know, what this question brings me to is the issues of margins. I think I've been always interested in what is happening, not at the center of things, but what is the consequence of whatever is happening at the center of political discussions or economic growth or these other phenomenons. I'm interested in what is thought about, made into in these margins of society. I think the forest that we are being alluding to might be, in another novel that I wrote earlier, No One Will See Me Cry, the peripheries of Mexico City in the early 20th century, for example, as a space that is in alert and kind of responding critically to the decision making that takes place in downtown Mexico City, where the powers, when authorities are making most of the decisions. And I just think that there is this energy and this possibility of criticism and rebellion, this possibility of insubordination, precisely in those areas that are less surveilled than others, and right now in the taiga is the forest, and in the Ilia crest is that the ocean, the presence of the ocean, and the border between the city of the north and the city of the south, and as I said, the insane asylum in early 20th century Mexico. So in different ways, using different strategies and different levels of realism in all these stories, because as you've noticed, I've moved from some works that are based on documentary research to works that might reach the it's the fantastic. It's working within the contract of the fantastic. So, but in all of them, I think what is common to all of them is this willingness to go to places that are not necessarily at the center of things, and I'm going there for that energy and for that complication. And that's where life occurs, I think. That is when it's erupting, and that's when things happen.
Well, one of your nonfiction books is an engagement with the work of Juan Rulfo.
Yeah.
And others, like the blurb that I mentioned at the beginning of Daniel Borzutzky, mention Rulfo in relationship to the Taiga Syndrome. And I did wonder about Rulfo's portrayal of the town Comala, the real and the imagined town in relationship to your book. Do you see your real and psychic territory in the Taiga Syndrome to be in conversation with Pedro Paramo, or not so much?
Oh, by the way, you mentioned earlier about the material conditions of writing, and I think I didn't think I touched upon that, but the work that you're referring to, that book about Rulfo, had to do centrally with that question. I mean, how come this writer, who was born in the provinces of Mexico, was able to write these two wonderful books that so much marked literary history of modern Mexico. And instead of just, in trying to answer that question, instead of just reading his works, which many people have done in wonderful ways as well, I went to do some research about his jobs and what these jobs allowed him to do or not to do, and the connection that these jobs created with government projects that had that were linked to processes of modernization in southern Mexico. So just to give you an idea of my Juan Rulfo, is not only my reading of Pedro Páramo, which obviously is one of the most important works of not only of Mexican literary history, but of literature written in Spanish. And but at the same time, my relationship with Rulfo is mediated by all these considerations about the things that he had to go through and to do in order to be able to create that Comala, that city of the death, that place in which we are never sure if characters are dead or alive, that limbo, so to speak. And I would say that in that sense, there is the kind of point of view, the kind of perception that Rulfo inaugurates for Mexican literature, the attention to detail that is not, as he said, linked to any kind of specific message. That's something that I totally shared with Juan Rulfo. That's something that I aspire to do in any case. I'm less interested in the aspects that views that portray him as this genius that somehow just appeared out of the blue. Yeah. And I'm more interested in ways of looking at Rulfo as a man of his times, with a body and a history and a labor history that limited and allowed the literature that he created. So I think that that influenced the kind of relationship that he had with space and with geography. He was a agente de ventas. That's a
salesman?
Yeah, he worked for a tire company, and as such, he had to travel throughout the country, and he took pictures while doing that. And what I wanted to understand, usually you see I don't know if you've been to these expos of Juan Rulfo's photographies. If you see them, they are beautiful. I mean, you would think that he is a photographer, which he was. I mean, he has that kind of eye and the technical expertise and just the perspective of his gaze is just wonderful. But what I didn't want to forget while thinking about his work and the way in which he looked at the world is that he was doing that as an employee of either a private company that like this Goodrich Euskadi company, or as an employee of the Mexican government who was so radically and dramatically transforming specifically southern Mexico. He participated in something that was called la Comisión del Papaloapan, that had a lot to do with the displacement of entire indigenous communities in Oaxaca and in Mexico. So that adds complexity, ethical and political complexity to Rulfo and his way of looking at the world. And I want that. Yeah. So it's not only this beauty that we see there in that black and white photography and that all these very interesting questions about death and life and suffering, but it's also that even more complicated relationship to Mexican government, Mexican agencies, and processes of modernization that ended up with entire communities and ways of life that are also Mexico.
Well, if we imagine that the reflexive way that people want to hold forth a canonical writer as a genius that comes out of nowhere, mm-hmm. particularly male writers, I think, more than women. How was this received? Given how cherished he is, I would think that perhaps it was unwelcome to to some quarters to peek behind the curtain and make him more complex. I mean, I think perhaps there are people who cherish it not being complex, to cherish this sort of magical being who descended down to the typewriter and made this incredible book.
You know what Marguerite Yourcenar used to say about love? That it was better to love with your open eyes. And that's when I started to see some of these reception of the book, specifically by una fundación, the Juan Rulfo Foundation. They were very uneased by this book. And what I said is, this is love. I mean, I love his work, and it's been so important to me, but I'm willing to love him with my open eyes.
Yeah.
And I don't think that adding complexity to an author that you cherish is there is nothing bad about that. I mean, it's just, as I said, you add a different layer, you ask an uncomfortable question, and you get uncomfortable answers. But that's what we do as writers. Can you imagine if we were only asking the questions that are going to be appeasing our world? What kind of writers would we be? So I'm gladly a writer who asks uncomfortable questions, and that's the kind of work that I do. And I take responsibility for that, and I do it as seriously as I can. I conducted research in archives in terms of the Rulfo book, and as I did for No One Will See Me Cry. And I do all kinds of research, personal and like in these other books, and the Taiga Syndrome. I mean, you have to go very deep into yourself to come back with these words, and that's research as well.
Yeah.
So that's writing. Mm-hmm.
In case you just tuned in, we're talking today to Cristina Rivera Garza about her latest book in English, The Taiga Syndrome from Dorothy. Well, to return to the Taiga Syndrome, there's this theme of hunger and scarcity, not only in Hansel and Gretel and Little Red Riding Hood, but also in the stories and rituals of the people of the taiga in the Taiga Syndrome, who, because of the scarcity of food, have become, by necessity, complicit in the forest's exploitation and destruction.
Yeah.
But despite the scarcity, they have a community feast.
Yeah.
That is, in a way, I think, a political act of resistance against the scarcity that leads them to destroy the non-human. Which made me want to ask you some questions about communication and community. For instance, you had a public email exchange with Lina Merwane, who came on the show for El Sangre and El Ojo. And you talk about a book by Jean-Luc Nancy called The Inoperative Community, about unexplored links between his concept of community and the idea of communality in anthropologists you were reading at the time, like Floriberto Diaz.
Yeah.
So in this exchange, you say there is a relationship between communality and disappropriation. I know you've written extensively about community, communality, and culture in your as-of-yet untranslated nonfiction books. So I was hoping maybe you could talk a little bit about these themes in relationship to the Taiga Syndrome.
You cannot see me, but I'm smiling because I love this question. I've been writing a lot about communality, and writing, because, as I said at the beginning, I'm always trying to complicate that passage from experience into page, and I really believe that there is an ethical questioning inherent to that process, and so I've been always looking for ways of going through that in a responsible, intellectually responsible way, and I have been reading a lot of these French theorists who are very, they write beautifully, and sometimes they have good ideas. But then when I started reading Floriberto Diaz, who is an anthropologist from the highlands of Oaxaca, speaker of Mije, I was just struck by the way in which many of the aspects that were so relevant for him as he was discussing the idea of communality had become for me in terms of my relationship to writing. And what was interesting to me there is that he spoke of communality not only as an association of people, but as something that was glued by labor, actual labor and participation of its members. So that's when I started to think very clearly, more clearly, I would say, about writing as a form of labor, and obviously not necessarily wage labor, but a multi-layered idea of what labor entails in this case. And that allows me to think about critically, essentially about issues of appropriation, which had been so relevant in certain discussions, in the experimental community. Discussing these ideas with people from Oaxaca, I think it was a collaborative way of, getting to this concept of disappropriation. Essentially, a way of uncovering, opening up, disclosing very clearly the many voices and the many components, other people's writings that are always included in what we end up signing as our own, right? So I think we always do that. That's part of our culture. Barthes famously proclaimed that was writing a series of quotes of culture. And the kinds of work that I'm more interested in right now are those that are taking care of making sure readers know that what in the writing process belongs to or comes from other sources. And I'm not saying this in terms of just the policeman who is trying to, say this is yours or not yours, because that's not the issue that interests me the most. It's not ownership what interests me the most, but the kind of joyous, complicated connection that we established with other people's work and labor as we write. So I wouldn't have been able to think about all these things without reading Floriberto Diaz in Oaxaca. And yes, I've been writing about that, and hopefully we'll get a translation of those essays in the near future. So,
do you think we're going to see some of your nonfiction books in English?
I hope so.
I hope so.
Yeah.
They look incredible.
I hope so, but I cannot say anything right now.
Okay.
But we are making efforts.
Okay. We'll all hold our breaths in the meantime. So you have this really amazing essay in English, The Unusual Manifesto.
Oh.
And you take this question of individuality and scarcity and you sort of recontextualize it around the notions of community and of debt. And I was hoping you would read 2 paragraphs from it for us.
All right. Interconnected as we are, affected by human and non-human life in their myriad layering, bodies are history embedded. Our bodies are time, practice. In giving an account of oneself, Judith Butler argued that the tail of the I inevitably takes us to the space of the you, and I'd add to the terrain of the we. Once these connections are established as both material and constitutive, discussion about the embodied nature of writing has to lead to the denormalization of the usual, transforming it into what it actually is, a historical contingent condition we can change. Unusualness is the site of our potency. Unusualness is writing. Indebtedness. Writing is a community-making practice. If we write with others, inescapably. If we write about others, even when we write about ourselves in small diaries that remain hidden in locked drawers. Constantly borrowing from the language we share with entire and varied communities at once. When we write, we acquire a debt, a real, material debt, with the practitioners of such languages. It's an immense debt. It is, as Fred Moten and Stephen Harney argued in the Undercommons, a debt that is or will become unpayable. We cannot hide it or deny it. The only thing left to do is increase it. We should render it visible in any case, palpable, far away from notions of social responsibility, which are often depicted as optional decisions depending on the ideology of each author. The dead I'm talking about here is both undeniable and inescapable. If we write, we are in debt. If we write, we owe. This debt transverses all writing. It shapes it. It gives it life, legitimacy. This debt is connected to bodies at work, gendered bodies, material bodies, bodies in conflict.
We've been listening to Cristina Rivera Garza. So I was curious about this idea of debt and the debt that we accumulate by writing as we draw forth from our writing predecessors. Mm-hmm. Is that what you mean when you call the literary phase we are in now post-autonomous?
Look, that's a very interesting discussion. I took that from Ludmer, Josefina Ludmer, an brilliant Argentinian thinker, recently deceased, and she was talking about the kind of works that interested her at that point, works that were easily to classify as strictly literary, works whose major task was not to become literary but to produce present. And I thought that was such a cool idea. I mean, I'm interested in words less because they are or not literary enough, and more because they are relevant, they make sense, they become part of our lives, and they are, in that sense, producing present.
And that sort of connects back to the hope of a book becoming part of someone else's dreams.
Of course.
Yeah,
Yes.
I love that.
Yeah.
So I want to quote another thing from Jean-Luc Nancy from the preface of the Inoperative Community. The community that becomes a single thing, body, mind, fatherland, leader, necessarily loses the in of being in common, or it loses the with or the together that defines it. It yields its being together to a being of togetherness. The truth of community, on the contrary, resides in the retreat of such a being. When I think of community that loses the thing that defines it, the with and the together and the being together, I definitely think of borders and nationalisms and ethno-nationalisms and the relationship of borders to bodies and of course the current situation in the United States among many other places. But I also think of exclusions on the level of language. In the Iliac Crest, the male narrator's two female housemates speak an invented language that excludes him and sort of others him in his own home. And in the Taiga Syndrome, the multiple levels of translation always make us unsure of what is being said. And the native inhabitants, they remain on the other side of a linguistic divide, and yet at the same time, they house our detective and our translator in a cabin where the couple they are pursuing once briefly stayed. And that cabin is a cabin that the Taiga native community avoids and fears. And so they themselves, in a way, exclude and other their guests. They've invited them to a space within their community, but just like the male character who is othered in his own home, they bring them into their home in a way, but in a sense, they're at the same time excluding and othering their guests. And then this question of exclusion in language goes to the syntax itself also in the book, as you mentioned, with so many sentences that begin with the subordinated conjunction that, which implies something that exists before, but that we don't know and aren't provided. So I want to hear a little bit about absences and exclusion as theme and as linguistic device.
Yeah, no, what a wonderful question. What a wonderful take on the whole thing. You made me think about this issue of guests, which is also central to the Iliac Crest. A guest that arrives to a home and imposes herself, right? And a hospitality that is kind of forcibly yielded from the owner of the home, and in which he eventually will find himself segregated, right? And So I'm always very intrigued by these kind of oscillations, how one thing might become the opposite immediately after it takes place, and how fragile are dispositions of who is the host, what are the rights of the host, and who is the guest, and the whole complication around that. I think a lot of that has to do with my relationship to this country. I arrived here at the end of the 20th century, and thinking that I was visiting. I came here to do my PhD, thinking naively that I was going to be able to go back to my country. Back then, as right now, Mexico has undergone tremendous economic crisis. And I had an opportunity to stay here, and for many, many years I stayed here in my mind as a guest, and it's not been. It's been until recently that I realized that, if you're a guest for some 20 years, that means that perhaps you're something else.
Yeah.
And there is a different predisposition towards language and my connection with the communities that I was living with, and I am. And I guess all what you were describing in your question, to me, has been filtered through that experience, and what that experience has forced me to think. So is this guest who becomes a non-guest now becoming also a host, which is in many ways translating things, writings from English into Spanish has turned me into that, and it's not easy. It's not a stable situation. It's an always in progress type of situation, and it's a situation that has important political consequences. I know that my work is only recently being translated into English, and it's not been until I quit thinking that I was a guest in this country that I became more interested in the translation process. I've been living in this country, writing in mostly in Spanish, although I've been also writing in English. I haven't published what I've written in English directly. But I think it's just amazing that I've been able to lead a writing life in Spanish in this country, meaning that obviously Spanish is not a foreign language in this country. There are about 50 million of Spanish speakers right here, and about 10 or 11 million of those are bilingual. And a lot of what I'm writing in Spanish is tainted inevitably by my very close relationship with English, something that to me is way more relevant at the level of the syntax of my sentences than on the use of actual words in Spanish or English in a sentence. But that's another conversation. In any case, it seems to me that my own transformation in terms of how I viewed my connection with the United States and with English has generated a lot of the ideas that you see there in terms of becoming a guest, ending that process, and becoming a more active member of trans-border communities. I'm not planning to quit my very close relationship to Spanish and to Mexico, but I'm definitely way more interested now in reactivating a conversation that I've had for many years with certain traditions of U.S. literature. And it was so funny. It was a conversation that I had with them, but without them knowing that they were in a conversation with me, because I was talking and sharing that conversation with my communities in Spanish in Mexico. But I'm now way more interested in opening up and becoming a real participant in a conversation with others. And I think that the translation of these books are helping in that sense.
Yeah, I would imagine it would be. So you also raised the question of exclusion, not just the level of sentence and plot, but when it comes to gender.
Yeah.
As I mentioned, the male protagonist in the Iliad Crest is excluded from this hermetic language of his two women compatriots, but he is also being told by many of the women in the book, something that he doesn't yet realize about himself, that he is actually a woman, despite how he sees himself.
Yeah.
And in your book, La Muerte Me Da, it is the male body, not the female body, that becomes the site for social violence, with the detective investigating a series of castrations. And in this book, we don't actually find out that our narrator is a woman until quite late in the narrative, when her publisher hires a female double to impersonate her. So talk to us about your desire to subvert gender at both the level of syntax and the level of story with these various strategies.
I think every time that we take gender seriously, we have to subvert syntax, and we have to subvert pretty much everything. Right now, in Mexico, there are many young women. They're organizing and denouncing sexual violence, specifically in within the literary circles of Mexico. And I think it's such an important subversive act, something that I have never seen before in Mexican literary circles. So just as in real life, when women speak and when they speak their truth, when they dare to put their word out there on a table of negotiation, so to speak, the world trembles. The world is transformed, and the same happens when we are writing. When I think we are always dealing with gender. Things, objects that we touch are gendered. Bodies are gendered. I mean, it is inescapable, but we have to take it seriously, and we have to take it to the ultimate consequences. And when we do that, there is no way we can speak the same language. There is no way we cannot read in between lines a different story. I'm very interested in that different story, and what this different story is going to do, not only for the book I'm writing, but for the world in which I live.
Can you talk to us a little bit about your fascination with doubles? Because we have the female double in the Taiga Syndrome, and we have the doubling of characters in the Iliad Crest. And even in short fiction like El Hombre que Siempre Soñó, we have this question of doubles. And I wondered if it was something connected to versioning or something else. That's
a wonderful way of saying it, of seeing it. I always say that we work with obsessions because we don't see them, right? And this might be one of them. So I have that. And now that you bring it up.
Well, you think about an Iliad Crest, Amparo Davila.
Yeah, Amparo Davila. Although I see that in a different way, though. I was very interested in rescuing and bringing up her work, which I think is beautiful and very relevant for the mid-century generation. And I wanted to work very explicitly with that, with the way in which she constructs atmospheres and dialogues and things like that. But yes, you are right. There was Amparo Davila, and then there were the younger Amparo Davilas, and there is usually, now that you make me think about that, there are usually twins and people who look exactly like, but they are not necessarily. Yeah, I'll go with you on that one.
Okay.
I think that's a versioning aspect of things.
All right. Let's just say it is for now.
Yeah.
Well, when I think of doubles in relationship to you, someone who's lived much of your life on the border, who engages with the world through two languages and in conversation with two literary traditions, I did want to ask you specifically about the question of translation in relationship to your work, as I've read that you participated in and were engaged in conversations, as you mentioned earlier, with your translators as they were brought to English. And I've always thought it must be strange to tour for a book in a language that you didn't write, but also at a time that's far distant from when you wrote the book. So you wrote The Taiga Syndrome in 2012. And so the books aren't necessarily coming out in the order or in any sort of timeliness with regards to the books that are most alive in terms of what you're writing now. But I love how you've inverted the notion of translation in that you've talked about how your books were written in Spanish, but they were first conceived in the nest of English.
Yeah.
And that that it seems like this book is returning to its original language in many ways, even though you wrote it in Spanish.
Yeah.
So what does that mean that the Taiga Syndrome is now returning to its original language?
And this is absolutely true. And it's something that I hadn't thought about until I started to read, to participate in readings with this book. I just noticed that the conversations that I developed around both the Iliad crest and the Taiga Syndrome were so much as the ones that I imagined I should have had when I published them in Spanish. In Spanish, I had other kinds of conversations, and they were very interesting too. But the ones that I had imagined, the ones that had motivated me to write the book, I didn't find them until I was reading these books in public and in English.
Wow.
And at that point, that's when it struck me. I was like, well, that this is what is happening, that these works, obviously, were written originally in Spanish, but they were conceived in a language in which I was living. And I've been just so perplexed by that. Because we're talking about two different levels. I mean, I wrote them in Spanish because, as I said earlier, I've been very careful and very interested in maintaining that conversation with my country and with my other country too, and writing in Spanish. But I had to realize that a lot of the syntactic elements of the writing and many of the ideas that I was dealing with belonged to very closely to my experiences as a person who's lived in this country, and this country that is also my country.
Right.
So I don't know what this is going to lead to, and I don't know if I'm going to be more open about, the writing that I've done in English. I don't know if I'm ready to do that. But definitely it's done something to the way in which I conceived myself as a writer in between borders, and as someone who definitely wants to be way more active in this conversation in this side of the border now.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you've talked about how you live in an English language world, and in this world you write in Spanish, but that if you spend a long time in Mexico, if you spend a long time there, you'll end up writing in English.
Yeah, and I missed English so much too.
Yeah. But you've mentioned that in an interesting way. You said that you miss what you call your second language-ness, a more awkward way of looking at things. So if you're immersed in a Spanish language world, there's a craving to write in English to create this sort of awkward way of looking at things. And it reminds me a little bit of the way Valeria Luiselli described her process when she was on the program, because she shifts between back and forth between writing in Spanish and English. But when she writes something in English, she always translates it back into Spanish for the book, and then it gets translated into English by her translator.
Yeah, no,
so
it's
not by hers.
Yeah.
But in her case, it feels like there's more of a spilling over back and forth between the two as she's writing one work. Whereas you characterize the mother tongue as an intimacy yield by familiarity, and the second language as an intimacy brought about through hypervigilance.
Yeah.
And I was curious about that word hypervigilance and what you mean. So tell us about hypervigilance with second languageness and what it provides you, because it's not, she's looking, Valeria seemed like a more harmonious process, and it sounds like you're craving something that is almost intentionally disharmonious.
Disharmonious, yes, and something that brings about conflict. And that sense of familiarity through which things might become dull or apparently known, right? It's something that I've been always very suspicious about. And when I say always, I mean ever since I've been in this country, which is, as I've said, many, many years. And with the second language, and when I'm in Mexico and when I'm here, I mean, the issue of the second language changes, varies, obviously. But what is common to that is the sense to be on alert, to be always looking at things. There is a complete defamiliarization of the environment in which I find myself in. So And that's so useful for writing. That's just that's that critical voice that is always saying there must be another way of looking at this thing, and you might not be seeing that because it's uncomfortable, but then you have a chance to do that in a more explicit way because you have this other outlet. And so I'm always looking for that now. And I guess that's the reason why I miss English when I'm in a more Spanish dominated environment, and you know, I miss Spanish, of course, when I'm only, and for entire days only speaking English, and I think right now I have developed an accent both in Spanish and in English. I thought that I didn't have a foreign accent in Spanish, but I've been told that I have a little bit.
Oh.
And that's just so strange.
Yeah.
And but I guess it's just part of making the familiar unfamiliar, and being able and willing specifically to go through all its complexities. And you know, writing for me is a way of critical thinking. I mean, at the very basic thing of what I do, the possibility of looking at the world in a different way, from a different angle. That's what the most important books, the books that I remember, that's what they've given me. And at the very basic level, I think that's the kind of book that I think I'm writing. And in order to do that, this second languageness has become increasingly relevant. It doesn't matter if I'm writing in Spanish or in English. My Spanish is deeply informed by all these discussions and by all the syntactic, linguistic decision making that goes through when I'm writing. And the same for English. I don't see that now as a matter of mastering, but as the willingness to play with and to get to the ultimate consequences of whatever I'm doing in each language.
You've written about a poet that I really love, Juliana Spar.
Yeah.
And you describe Spar as having distanced herself voluntarily from what you call the average English in order to say something about language and how, in your words, it forms us in uneven dynamic context.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Do you see that as a kindred move to what you're describing?
Absolutely. She has this wonderful essay, The 90s, and you can find it online. And that's what she's talking about, the move away from mainstream English. That's if I remember well, that those were her words, and then she goes on and analyzing, exploring a series of writers who do that, not in terms of the relationship to identity, but in terms of the relationship to language. And what I get to think about that is that obviously we know there is a very rich history of Chicano writing, of Mexican American writing, and I'm deeply interested in that history. I was last night at this reading by Canto Mundo, and it was just magnificent, and the poetry and the connection. It was just great. So I'm very interested in that aspect too of this exploration. But in terms of Juliana's essay, what really struck me is that she's displacing this issue of identity as something that is already formed and right there, and more to this flexible, fluid, complex relationship in between languages. And there is a history of imperialism there. There's a history of power making that we need to interrogate. And I think in that sense, this second languageness is just a privileged position to do that. Mm-hmm.
Well, I want to return briefly to the phenomenon of the Taiga Syndrome, not the book, but the mental, mental or psychic state. So when I think about the danger of living in the taiga being the contraction of Taiga Syndrome, a form of claustrophobic anxiety that's induced by open, endless, non-human spaces, I wonder about borders in relationship to mental illness and mental illness in relationship to language. I was looking through some of your academic writing where you've looked at the ways psychiatry and psychiatric terminology was used in Mexico as a form of social control, at the implications of an insane person no longer being seen as a ferocious animal, but rather as a grown-up child, and the ways vocabulary and psychiatric narrative were used to enforce norms around gender and class, as the people who receive these labels tended to be poorer people and often women. But you also look at the way these women, these supposedly insane inmates, subverted and took control of the narratives. You said that as social beings, which you mentioned earlier, as social beings, we tell stories, but that is not necessarily the purview of the writer. That contrary to what we think of, writer as storyteller, the responsibility of the writer is to examine, question, subvert, transform, and challenge language. And I was interested in this, both to hear more about your relationship to story and plot, but also in a way, these women, these insane women or insane poor people who, of either gender, become the writers in your examination academically, because in a sense they're the ones they're not the storytellers, they're the subversion of the story. So the story being told to them, whether you're insane, you're a grown-up child, and then their actions within that seem to mimic in an interesting way the things that you're doing with the plots that you provide us around a detective story or around a fairy tale. And then within that, the writer is, I don't know if dismantling them or turning them upside down.
Yeah, no, how interesting. I remember when I was looking at the files of the La Castañeda, which is the state insane asylum founded in 1910. Right before the Mexican Revolution erupted in November 20th. So the insane asylum was established in September the 1st, 1910. And I read more or less 300 of these medical files. And one of the things that was extremely interesting to me is what I found there is a life story as a way of a dialogue, but not a free dialogue, of course. I mean, it was a conversation in between a doctor and a patient, and usually his or her family as well. It might have involved also the participation of the police, because many of these inmates, as they were called back then, were brought to the institution in police cars. So just looking at the way in which this very controlled conversation by an official interrogatory allowed yet the possibility to these inmates to tell their story made me think about the many operations, the many negotiations, the many linguistic and social and cultural acrobatics that these inmates had to go through in order to be able to pass, for their stories to pass through the vigilance, so to speak, of the psychiatric language. So I guess I've been looking at books and at writing in that way. So what can I do? What kind of tools I can use in order for the inmate, or whatever whatever character will take the place of the inmate in some other books, the person whose story is said to be unreliable, the point of view that we are not supposed to be taking into consideration, the one who is always silent. So what kind of things have they done in order for us to be able to know their stories? That's something that I would like to, that I've been trying to replicate and critically explore in much of what I've written so far. I think that this is a deeply political aspect. It's not only about uncovering silences or listening to the stories of the stories that have been neglected historically. I mean, all that is good and is important, of course. But in terms of the usage of our tools, what can I use? From what kind of subject, verb, predicate, construction can I use or can I change in order for me to be able to decode, if not tell the story, that story that I'm interested in. In the kind of stories that I'm interested in are the ones that are hard to tell, the ones that people actually don't want to tell because either they hurt so much or because they don't know them entirely. And so that's when I think when that challenge is in front of me, that's when things become exciting in terms of the form, but important to me, at least, in terms of the political consequences of what I do. Yeah.
I love this idea that the psychiatrist is the storyteller. I don't know if you've diminished the idea of the story, but you've made it very common. Like, that's what we all do. We all tell stories, and the psychiatrist is telling a story. And the inmate, the person who's supposed to be powerless and is supposed to submit to the story, if they subvert it, they're the writer, and in a sense, they become the protagonist.
Yeah.
And our protagonist in the Taiga Syndrome is a writer, not just a detective. And I just want to have you read a really brief description of her own writing practice in her words.
And it's a writer of minor noir novels.
Minor noir novels.
Novelitas negras, dice, no? Yeah. I visit myself organizing a small house that I had abandoned years ago and dedicated my time to writing about the cases I had worked on, but I wrote them differently. It wasn't that I solved in my imagination what I was unable to solve in reality. It wasn't that my dismal figure transformed, thanks to the grace of fiction, into a glamorous heroine or an ill-bred villain. My new method was to recount a series of events without disregarding insanity or doubt. This form of writing wasn't about telling things how they were or how they could be or could have been. It was about how they still vibrate right now in the imagination.
When I was reading that, I just wondered if that was a description of your own writing, if that was sort of an ars poetica, this idea of not disregarding insanity or doubt, but also not really telling things how they are, but focusing on how they vibrate right now.
Yeah.
Do you see yourself reflected in your protagonist's writing philosophy?
It looks like a poetics to me.
It does.
And yeah, the short answer is yes. And what I would have to say, though, is that behind this idea of the telling things how they were, how they still vibrate, I have very much in mind that very famous phrase by Walter Benjamin. Do you remember that one about the? It was oh my gosh, so famous that I forget it right now. But it was something about looking at the story through the light, through the flash of light of the present, right? Mm-hmm. And to me, instead of using the metaphor of the light, which tends to clarify and is looking for a conclusion or an answer, I think the issue of vibration involves more something that you have to feel in your body rather than only in your intellectual capacity. So that kind of present interests me. Yeah, totally.
Well, as a sort of a final question, I wanted to ask you about a question about fiction versus nonfiction for you, because the Taiga Syndrome was your last book of fiction, published in Spanish in 2012. And since then, you've written multiple books of documentary nonfiction, which haven't yet been translated into English. And you've wondered if you want to write fiction anymore. Mm-hmm. And I'd love to hear about that, because your fiction does engage with many real concerns in the non-fictional world. It deals with borders and immigration, with psychiatry and gender, with femicide and sexual violence, the marginalization of women and women artists. So what made you feel like remaining in the fictional realm with these topics was no longer satisfactory?
It's been something that has troubled me for a while too. You remember what Karl Ove Knausgaard said about fiction? I kept it with me for a long time. He said that in a world in which pretty much everything has become fiction, the real power of fiction has radically diminished. And I think in many ways that's true. What can fiction do in a world in which you have caravans of people trying to cross the border and asylum rights are being denied to them? What can fiction do in terms of all these women who are right now denouncing countless instances of sexual violence against them, perpetrated on daily basis in homes and offices in Mexico and pretty much everywhere else? So very often I become frustrated. I'm rendered frustrated by the way in which we live, and obviously I have, as many have done, I have to interrogate my own privilege and my access to language and printing and this conversation and everything else. But then, one time, during my most troubled stage about fiction, I was teaching this workshop at UCSD when I was back then a professor. And I just started my class by asking them very honestly. And I said, this is not a rhetorical question. I wanted to hear your answers. Is fiction relevant to you? And these were like, I don't know. It was a huge class. It was an intro to fiction class. I had about 100 students in that place.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And I was just very disarmed. I wanted just to know their opinions. And it was just wonderful to see them. They came up with the usual, how fiction allows us to be on the shoes of others, and how it creates empathy, and how it allows to tell stories that otherwise the authorities or the powers that be might not let go through. And as usual, as all these answers were, they were also very hopeful to me. And so I've been right now I'm working on a book that is half fiction, and originally it was a work of nonfiction. But then something has happened to me, and I think that conversation that I had with my students at UCSD was a new departure for this reconnection to fiction. Right now, I'm writing this work that has to do is an exploration of a very, very real historical process that took place on the border between Texas and Tamaulipas. It's a cotton process, a cotton project that developed in the 1930s as many Mexicans were coming back. They were expelled from the United States, and they became deportees, and were trying to make their lives right there on the border. And many Mexicans from southern Mexico were also migrating up north, looking for better conditions of life. So my family took part on this social experiment of Cardenismo in the 1930s, and so I wanted at the beginning to document the story and to tell it in a more in a nonfiction type of way. But then there were many things that I couldn't answer, or not even answer. I couldn't even touch. By doing that. And so fiction slipped through, found its way back. And right now, we were talking about being a host or a guest. Right now, I think fiction is the host of the story. And I'm quite pleased by that. It's not the same kind of fiction that I was writing before. I went through my whole turmoil and my whole questioning. It is a fiction that is showing the process, as what I went through, but it's still fiction with its power for empathy and its power for connection, and it's the possibility that it gives us to see ourselves in others. And I think at this point in time in these countries, I think that's one of the most important political leaps that we are allowed, and I'm glad that fiction is there for us to do that.
Can we expect anything coming in the next year or two in English from you? Do you know of anything coming out?
I hope so. It's a very hopeful hope so.
Okay. Speaking of hope.
Yes.
Well, it was a great pleasure having you on the show,
Thank
Cristina.
You. No, thank you so much. I really enjoyed the questions. Thank you for the conversation.
We were talking today to Cristina Rivera Garza about the Taiga Syndrome from Dorothy Books. You've been listening to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's program was recorded at the studios of KBOO, volunteer-powered, non-commercial, listener-sponsored, full-strength community radio from Portland, Oregon, found at kboo.fm. You can find more of Cristina Rivera Garza's work at cristinariveragarza.blogspot.com. Cristina has recorded for the bonus archive a reading of 3 sections of her long poem, Third World. And I'm also uploading a conversation with Suzanne Jo Levine, one of the most notable translators of Latin American writers into English in the last 40 years. She talks about the pleasures and challenges of translating Rivera Garza, about the doctoral translation program she helms, and what it is like to pursue a career this way as a translator. These join supplemental material by Marlon James, Layli Long Soldier, Carmen Maria Machado, Therese Marie Myatt, Sheila Hetty, Forrest Gander, John Keane, Jen Bervin, Christine Scutt, and others. All of this can be found at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. Finally, I'd like to thank Imre Lodbrog and Barbara Browning for creating the outro. Their album, Imre Lodbrog, A Sapatita Me, can be found on iTunes, and Barbara Browning's trove of ukulele covers can be found at soundcloud.com/Barbara Browning.